Hey, so today we have Dr. Ashwini Deshpande with us. So we had done a presentation using her works earlier. So a lot of people had a lot of concerns and questions regarding a lot of the topics that were covered in the presentation. So we invited Dr. Ashwini Deshpande to our channel to sort of give to sort of answer some of the criticisms. So, Dr. Deshpande, do you want to sort of introduce yourself and sort of tell them what your background is and the main area of your research and so on?
So I'm a professor of economics at Ashoka University in the NCR region near Delhi. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. I have been working on what is broadly called economics of discrimination, focusing on caste, sex-based disparities, and affirmative action or reservations. So the broad idea is that our social identities affect our economic outcomes, and what can be done to remove some of the obstacles that the most stigmatized or the most marginalized groups face. So, what are the policies that could be undertaken? That's the broad area.
Okay. So, like a natural question, or like the main question that a lot of the young people have is basically, we don't like differentiate people on the basis of caste. So when I see a person, I don't look at what the caste background is and stuff like that. Sort of the main taglines in all of these protests are like, if you're an MBBS student, this is the placard you'll be holding, right? The doctors don't differentiate the patients on the basis of caste. Then why do you differentiate us on the basis of caste? This is like the most like common question that a lot of people have. So what do you have to say about that? Like that worry that people have?
It's a very valid concern. And I think our constitution and several of us, I wouldn't say all of us, but several of us share the vision of a world in which people would be treated equally or with equality, or there would be equity in the world, regardless of what caste or religion or gender they belong to. That's a vision of the world we would like to live. At least I would like to live in, and I'm sure many of your listeners would like to live in that world. Unfortunately, we are not there yet. So the reality on the ground is that if you have the misfortune of being born into certain groups, they could be religious groups, they could be caste groups, they could be gender groups, ethnicity, tribal status, linguistic groups, rural, urban. So these are all the various ways, various identities that can impact the economic outcomes or even social outcomes of an individual. And these are accidents of birth. These are circumstances over which we have no control. We just get born into a particular family. As long as we have economic and social structures that disadvantage particular identities, and we don't have to look at every single identity, but we can identify the most stigmatized or the most disadvantaged identity. How can we create a society where there's equality of opportunity? Outcomes can vary. You might be able to run a 100-meter race much faster than I can because you're a faster runner than I can. So for me to insist that I should be allowed to win that race would not be fair. But are we both in a situation that at least our starting points are equal? After that, if you run, it reflects the fact that you're a better runner than me. But supposing I was not even allowed to reach up to the starting point of that race because of my birth circumstances, that would be unfair, correct? And so I think that is the whole issue in a nutshell, which is yes, absolutely, we want to be in a society where these things should not matter. But the reality is, and that's a sad reality, is that these things should matter. These things do matter. Now, how do you go from what Ambedkar called equality in law towards equality in fact? Equality in law is when law treats everybody equally, which is what in the Indian constitution and the Indian legal system does. But that is what is called formal equality. how do we go from formal equality towards substantive equality, which is equality on the ground, equality in fact? And that transition is not easy, it's tricky. It's there are all these debates around that transition. And I might as well say it upfront. Unfortunately, Ambedkar's vision was to focus on the most marginalized, which were the groups that were considered untouchable earlier, before untouchability was illegal. Over time, the reservation system has grown to incorporate all kinds of groups, and I'm not sure that all the groups are that's an reservation is an instrument, but now it's become an instrument that there are multiple demands to be included in the reserved category because it gives certain benefits. I'm not sure personally whether that's a good idea. So while I am a supporter of the policy, I'm not necessarily a supporter of every group's demand to be included in that policy, because then it sort of defeats the purpose. So it's a very general answer, but I think this is the crux.
Yeah, so I would like to get back to you on like that point that you made, the actual implementation of the reservation policy. But before we go there, I just want to ask you about like what are the ways in which like people are discriminated on the basis of caste identities. So a good analogy is everyone is running a race, but certain people have some obstacles on their tracks, right, because of their caste identity. What are these obstacles? Is it just the material inequality, or are there like social structures, like social attitudes and stuff like that, unconscious biases that sort of play in? What is your reading on this?
So it's not just that there are obstacles, which there are more obstacles in the paths of some individuals than others. But if you can visualize a circular racetrack, where runners, and we are in the middle of Olympics, so everybody should be able to visualize that easily. So when runners are running in a circular racetrack, the person who is in the innermost track has to run the shortest distance because the track is the smallest, and the person who's on the outermost track has to run the longest distance just because the track is the longest. Now, how does sports solve this problem? The starting lines are different. So you give the person on the outermost track a certain advantage, right? If you see the starting line in any of these circular races, you will see that they are not exactly aligned in a straight line. So the person who's on the outermost track gets an advantage. That nobody calls that unfair. You just realize that the length of the track is different, right? And so what reservations do is, that's the kind of starting advantage that they provide, sort of to create a level playing field. Now, coming back to your question, one is that certain groups that are stigmatized on the basis of their untouchable past. So, if you look at any economic indicator, incomes, consumption levels, asset ownership, house ownership, land ownership, etc., etc., on all of those, they continue to be poorer than the so-called upper caste, or the castes that are ranked higher in the hierarchy, right? So that's the gap. If you look at changes over time in certain indicators, there has been the groups have come closer. For example, education levels up to the secondary level, because of the thrust of the government, various governments, state governments as well as the central government. Education has now expanded to reach a much wider section of society than it used to be. So educational gaps are narrowing up to the secondary level. But if you go to higher secondary and higher, graduate, etc., the gaps are not necessarily narrowing. And of course, there's a quality of education issue, which these indicators don't measure, because richer kids can go to better quality schools, they can afford private tuitions, they have better resources from within their families, etc. So that disparity still remains. So one is that the length of the race for the most marginalized is longer than the length of the race for the more privileged. That's one. The other are obstacles. So one is material deprivation, which is can be poorer nutrition, it can be lower access to healthcare, or access to poorer quality healthcare, poorer conditions of housing, etc., etc. Then there is social discrimination. So you began by saying that we really can't tell people's caste by just looking at the, and that's absolutely correct. caste or jati is not ascriptive in the same way that perhaps gender can be, or race can be. However, there is a line, sociologists used to talk about this line of ritual purity, that there are some jatis that are below that line of ritual purity. These were the ones that used to be considered untouchable. When it comes to that line, the social discrimination is pretty persistent. Every single day in the newspaper there is a story of some atrocity, or some intercaste marriage between a person who was below the line of ritual purity, the boy, and the girl above that line. The famous Marathi movie called Sairat is explains that. And just recently there was a murder inspired by the movie Sairat. I mean, not that Sairat caused it. Sairat was reflecting a situation that we have, where marriages between men who belong to jatis that were considered untouchable, and women who belong to higher castes groups, are still frowned upon, right? Um, Access to common resources, whether it's water, whether it is eating together. There are stories from villages where the if upper caste families find out that the cook that cooks the midday meal that is given to the school children, if that cook happens to belong to a caste that used to be considered untouchable, they will not send their children, they will not let their children eat that meal. Teachers discriminate. So there are societal discriminations, based upon the older notion of, or not so older actually, notion of untouchability, which, despite being illegal and despite actually being punishable by law, unfortunately is far more pervasive than we think it is. There is a data set called India Human Development Survey, which asks the question about, do you practice untouchability? And even though it's a practice, it's like saying, do you evade taxes? You even if you evade taxes, you will never say that I evade taxes, because you know that it's illegal. Do you know the national percentage of people who admitted to practicing untouchability? 30%, right? Which means that on the ground, many more people practice it, but they are just clever enough and don't say it, right? And people believe that it's a natural order of things. This is the way, society is ordained. People have different. People think of it as a division of labor, and as Ambedkar, very succinctly retorted to that, it's not a division of labor; it's a division of laborers. You're dividing laborers on the basis of their cost. It's not division of labor, right? Um, Unfortunately, all of these disadvantages remain very much stark and clear, particularly for groups that were considered untouchable. So, I would not advocate reservations as a solution for any economic disability, because if it is just economic, income caps, those can be fixed by providing income transfers or other economic. You don't need reservation for that, right? So if it's a question of poverty, if it's a question of just a generalized lack of access to good healthcare or good education or nutrition, any of those can be fixed through other means and should be fixed through other means. Reservation is meant to counter discrimination that happens on the basis of a stigmatized identity. I feel that in this clamor for reservations, we are forgetting the original purpose for which this was designated. And now every group wants reservation, right? That's not, I mean, I understand the anxiety that prompts individuals to say we want reservation, because there is an anxiety for good quality jobs, you know. Um, but that is a different, related but different conversation, which is how does economic policy need to accommodate the demand for work by a very large number of people in the working age group, not through reservation. Reservation doesn't create jobs, it just allocates jobs differently. So if there are 100 jobs, those will get allocated differently, but 100 will not become 200 because of reservation, right? So reservation is not a magic wand that solves all problems. I anticipated a lot of the questions you're going to ask, so I already answered.
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that you support the creamy layer filter in reservations. So, like, this.
No, I don't support it for SCST. No, because of what I just said. So the SCs are those jatis that were considered untouchable. Even today, discrimination against those individuals continues, and there is absolutely no evidence, not from India, not from anywhere else in the world, that when highly stigmatized groups become richer, they start being treated differently because now they are richer individuals. Barack Obama, back in the day when he was a senator, when he was not so well known, much before he became the United States president, he talks about a black tie event ball where he went. And in the black tie events, even the waiters and the valets wear black ties, and they also have to be dressed up, and somebody gave him their car keys thinking that he's a valet who's going to park their car, just because he was dressed well, but he was a black man. Oprah Winfrey, there's a very famous episode in France where she went to this very famous fashionable street to a very high-end designer shop, and she wanted to buy a bag. And she could have bought all the bags in that shop, except the store attendant didn't know who she was. She didn't recognize her. And she said, I can show you the bag, but you probably can't afford it. All she saw was a black woman, right? She didn't, and it was a rich black woman because Oprah doesn't look poor by any, by any stretch of the imagination. But the saleswoman thinking must have been, okay, it's a rich black woman. How rich can she be? I mean, she's a black woman at the end of the day, right? Um, these are just slightly benign examples of discrimination against richer members of marginalized groups. But there is no evidence that richer members of marginalized groups that have been subjected to extreme stigma. I would not make that argument for OBCs or other categories, but for Dalits, there is no evidence that richer members of the marginalized group do not face discrimination. Maybe that will happen, and I hope that happens. Once we get to that point, we can think of creamy layer exclusion. But do not support creamy layer exclusion for SCST. Just today, I have an article in the Hindustan Times on the subdivision, and I've written about it very clearly.
Okay, good. Yeah, I will link the article below if I can find it. Maybe you can email it to me. That way I can. Yeah, thank you so much. So, like, the question I was about to ask is, like, what is a good way to figure out what the creamy layer is? Is there a good criteria, or is there an empirical method that we can use to identify, these are the groups that are, creamy layer, even if it's in the OBC, category?
So groups are not classified as creamy layer. Individuals are classified, or households are classified as creamy layer. So think of a jati that gets a reservation. Okay. The idea of the creamy layer is that within that jati, so first of all, this whole process, there's a lot of procedure involved before you get designated as a jati that can suppose take an OBC jati, right? Now, supposing that OBC Jati, on the basis of a lot of submissions to the National Commission of Backward Classes, etc., there is a whole list of, I think it's 43 indicators that Mandal Commission had outlined. Supposing on the basis of multiple indicators, the commission decides that this particular jati is eligible for reservations. I'm talking about OBC, right? The next step is that the individuals within that jati that fulfill certain criteria are designated as creamy layer. They do not then get access to the reservation. So the OBC reservation is subject to creamy layer exclusion. And the government has designated a criteria for creamy layer. So they have to get a no creamy layer certificate. It is not as though a jati is creamy layer. Then the jati would not be eligible. If the jati is eligible, then the idea is that richer people within that jati should not get reservation. That's the point of the creamy layer.
So some people argue that so reservation undermines merit, right? So when it comes to, like, the really elite universities in India, IITs, AIMS, all of those important universities, they argue that having the reservation policy is actually cruel to the oppressed caste people, because they are entering a environment, that they're not meritorious to enter into, and they're struggling and they're dropping out, and that is the usual narrative that we hear, in our society. What do you have to say about like that narrative?
So that's a very good question, and again, it's a very valid concern. In the literature, this is called the mismatch hypothesis. So the idea is that you're setting them up for failure because you're putting them in situations that, because of their background, they are ill-equipped to handle. Right now, 2 3 points about this concern. So first of all, as a concern, it's a valid concern, no doubt. Okay. Second is that when you look at very high pressure environments like medical schools or engineering schools, there is an overall atmosphere of extremely high pressure where many students find themselves unable to cope, regardless of their caste background. So I think that there is need to look at, in a more nuanced manner, what are the stress inducing factors that make it very difficult for an average student, unless you're really really very close to the top of the marks distribution. Lakhs and lakhs of students take these exams and only a few hundred get selected. So it's a first of all, the preparation for this exam is very highly pressure inducing, and then of course you get in, the course itself is very high stress. Okay, so we have examples of dropouts, unfortunate suicides, distress, all kinds of distress that students face after they enter these exams. And so I think that it's, first of all, it is an overall problem that needs very urgent attention, right? And a lot of the stress at the entry point comes from the fact that the number of seats in relation to the number of applicants, there's a huge gap. So very few seats for very very large number of applicants. That's point number one. Point number two is that just as upper caste students come come into IITs or medical schools through in a very highly competitive process, so do SCs. I mean, there is a quota for SCs, but it's not like there are three SCs applying and all three get in. That's not what it is. There are thousands of SC applicants, from which a few get selected to these positions. So the competition for SCs is also very strong. So in our minds, the idea is, oh, somebody just can just walk into a medical school or an engineering school if you're SC. No, you also have to take those exams, and many people are not able to clear it, just as many upper caste students are not able to clear it. So the intense competition for entry is true for everybody. Second point, what happens after entry? We had a very tragic suicide of Rohit Vemula, and there have been other examples. Reservations guarantee entry, but they do not guarantee accommodation, or they do not guarantee acceptance. So yes, that struggle is very real for reserved category students. When they get in, they are not always easily accepted by peers, particularly because of this feeling that they are unfair entrants. They should not have been there. So there is, day-to-day microaggression or discrimination that they face. That's a very real part of their experience, and we have to find ways of institutionalizing. How do you solve that? Just like for sexual harassment, now there are committees in every institution. It would not be a bad idea to set up committees in every institution that can investigate complaints, if there are any complaints of harassment. Okay. And the final point is, there are few, but there are studies of people who graduated to become doctors and engineers um, through the medical schools or the engineering schools. Okay. Now, those studies have found that Dalit students who got into engineering school, there's one very important study of engineering schools in one state of India that finds that Dalit students who got into the engineering school performed better than Dalit students who didn't get into engineering schools 10 years after they graduated, and certainly had a higher standard of living and a better job than their fathers. So there was definitely an improvement. There's definitely socioeconomic mobility for Dalits who got in. Upper caste students who didn't get into the engineering school, of course, there was some disappointment that you didn't get in. But they ended up doing something else. And 10 years down the line, they were not worse off than their upper caste peers who got into engineering. So the moral of this story is that reservation for beneficiaries, reservation provides huge gains. For those who are not eligible, reservation doesn't necessarily lower their overall trajectory. Maybe they didn't end up becoming doctors or engineers, but they ended up doing something else, which wasn't, they landed on their feet, basically. So the benefit to the beneficiaries is greater than the cost to the. So, yeah, reservation has winners and losers, like every policy. There are trade offs. But the gain to the winners, which is those who are eligible, is greater than the cost to the losers, who are the upper caste students who get displaced by reservation. So on the whole, it increases overall, total gain. Uh, of course, if you don't get into a particular college that you were working towards, it is disappointing. But what do you do after that? You do something else, right? And is that necessarily that much worse off? Are you worse off 10 years down the line than you would have been had you got into that engineering school? Having said that, let me come back to the point about stress and about dropouts and about lack of assimilation, etc. All of these problems are very real, and but we need to look at them in a sensitive manner. The solution can't be, oh, therefore let's not admit SCs, because even amongst the non-SCs, dropouts, mental health issues, struggling to finish the curriculum. These are very high pressure environments. And students struggle, they suffer, you know. So these are definitely issues that are of larger relevance to the entire student body.
Okay. Yeah. So, like, I'm gonna like transition to the questions regarding meritocracy now, right? So this is like a popular, narrative that is in the minds of every young person in Kerala, at least. Like everyone thinks that we have to build our systems on the basis of merit and not caste, because even if we could say that, okay, these people are competing against each other within their own reserved categories, they're not as meritorious. That's what they believe. They're not as meritorious as the other people who compete in the general category and get into these institutions without any sort of reservation or anything. So, like in the context of jobs, for example, right? If you select people on the basis of like caste because they're discriminated and stuff like that, the system wouldn't function efficiently, is what some people believe. What do you have to say about that concern?
Um, Very good question again, and lots to unpack here. So first of all, let's focus on the question of merit. So how are we measuring merit here? We are measuring them through marks or grades, some entry score or some measure. So the fact is that if I have had the advantage of going to a really good school with all kinds of resources that my family could provide me, um, and if someone else did not have those kinds of resources, that person might be as intelligent as I am in innate intelligence sense, but it's highly likely that their exam scores will not be as good as mine, only because I got all those advantages. From that to conclude that therefore I'm just inherently more meritorious is is incorrect. Secondly, even as individuals, I think of myself, you can think of yourself, you can think of your cousins, your friends. How we performed in different exams in different institutions has varied a lot. Supposing hypothetically you failed a particular exam in some school year, how would you like it if, on the basis of that, everybody designated you as not meritorious? So, from henceforth, you're not allowed to enter any institution where you have any chance of improvement. Would that would that sound like a good policy? No, right? Anything can happen because of which you might have performed poorly in a particular exam. It's highly and I've been teaching now for 35 years now. I've seen students really blossoming when they go into an environment which they like, when they do courses which they prefer, as opposed to doing courses that they don't like. So even with all the background, disadvantages, advantages, etc., students' performance is variable depending on which context they are in. Students can really pull themselves up and do really spectacularly well in another setting, and they can really fail badly even if they had been toppers, all through in a previous setting. So the point is that at every stage of the education stream, you have to give equal opportunity to everybody. Now, that is not saying that you don't pay any attention to merit, but that's not what's happening. It's not like you go to a person on the street and say, "Hey, come and join this institution because you're SC." That's not what happens. You have to have the minimum eligibility that is needed to enter that institution. Once you have that minimum eligibility, you have a competitive process for all groups, but make sure that at the end of the day there is a mix in that group, because otherwise we are back to the racetrack analogy. Remember the length of the racetrack and remember the obstacles. People who have the longest track to navigate with the most number of obstacles will always do worse. It just is logical, right? You put no obstacles in somebody's path and you put lots of obstacles in the other person's path. In fact, I would say that despite the obstacles, if somebody has been able to clear an IIT entrance exam, that actually speaks for much more innate ability than somebody who got the advantage of all the private coaching and all of that, right? So here merit is not just innate ability. Merit is shaped by a lot of factors that are outside of that individual. What are the factors? Parents education, parents income. A well-fed person is always going to do better in exams than a person who's hungry. A healthy person is going to do better in exams than a person who's sick, right? So access to food, access to healthcare, access to nutrition, parental education, the house we live in. If my house is leaking and if it's been raining in the night, tomorrow's exam I'm not going to do well. Whereas if you are living in a house where you slept, had a good night's sleep, you're going to do better than me, right? And so these are all the factors that get reflected in that number that is supposed to be merit. Okay. So let's recognize merit for what it is. Okay, now let's come to the second part of this question, which nobody asks, but which we should ask. Now, engineering schools, particularly in South India, all not all, but several of the private schools have quotas for those who can pay money, donations. Most institutions have management quotas. Okay, what is the criterion through which these students are getting into these institutions? If I get into a school through a management quota, what is the reason I got in? Tell me.
Because I'm rich.
No, my parents are rich. I'm rich because my parents are rich, right? I got in because my parents are rich, and my parents' networks are such that I got into that particular college or school or whatever it is, right? So where did my merit go? Why are there no questions being asked about my merit? Can we get rid of all management quota? Are we okay with that? I mean, I'm okay with it, but are people who are asking these questions, are they okay with that? Second, there are many other quotas that exist. SC/ST and OBC is only one. That's the caste based. There is domicile quota. Just recently, Karnataka government said whatever 50% of jobs in Bangalore have to be kept for local residents, etc. Right? These are hugely popular policies. Is that about merit? There are quotas for children of war widows. Right? It's a compensatory um, sort of provision for individuals who sacrifice their lives for the sake of the country, and so their children get some provisions. Okay, we all agree that that's a good idea, right? Is that about merit in the way that you're defining? First of all, you have to define merit differently. So my point is that compensatory schemes, because of certain disadvantages that individuals faced because of circumstances over which they had no control, exist for not just certain caste groups, but for a whole range of individuals and groups that suffer different kinds of disability. And domicile is not even a disability. So, I mean, I'm just completely taken aback each time the domicile quota comes up. What is the disadvantage that you face because of being a resident of Karnataka or Kerala or wherever it is, right? Why do you need reservation, right? Yet those kinds of quotas we are very happily willing to go along it. The minute it comes to caste quotas, we start raising questions about merit. Why? If somebody is not getting in through a completely open competition, and if we think that that is the murder of merit, how is it that that argument doesn't apply to to hereditary reservations? Look at family owned firms in India. I'm talking about corporate, the formal corporate sector. And we don't have to try hard to think of names. We just lived through a 6 month wedding ceremony of one of the biggest names, right? Now, the current bosses of that company are children of the person who set it up. The upcoming bosses are children of the person of individuals who are currently the bosses. I'm sure, pretty sure that their children will end up inheriting the company. Merit? Really? I don't know if any merit testing was done. It's hereditary. Okay. And so, what I'm trying to say is that when upper caste children do well in exams, they are their good performance partly might reflect innate intelligence. I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. Um, but it's innate intelligence combined with a lot of advantageous circumstances. When I think of my own life, to think of, oh, I am able to do all this or write all these books because I'm just innately just supremely brilliant, that would be stupid on my part. If I don't recognize all the privilege that I have myself, I was just privileged to be born into the family that I was born into. And that has shaped who I am for sure. That doesn't mean that all children born into my family have the same trajectory, but for us to deny that that didn't play any role in where we are today, that would just be foolish and it would be very incorrect and vain. We can't be vain. We have to recognize that our circumstances at birth played a big role in, and it's a lottery. It's a lottery of birth, right? So that's my answer to that sort of questions.
Yeah. So, does the reservation policy undermine the efficiency of the system? So, like, I understand you did a study in the Indian Railways and so on. Do you want to expand more on that?
So it's a very common belief that if you because if you look at Indian government enterprises, the reason that they are not so as efficient as they perhaps could be is because of reservation. Okay, so this is again just a belief. There is no zero data to prove that, right? I've worked in lots of institutions, worked with a bunch of colleagues, and there are efficient people and inefficient people in reserved categories and non-reserved categories. This is not to say that all reserved categories individuals are efficient or vice versa. So I think individuals are efficient or not, but on average, is there any evidence to suggest that reservation has lowered efficiency? There isn't any. Okay, so I have a study of the Indian Railways, where we looked at data for 23 years. There's a certain political scientists. There's one paper that has looked at IAS. They've been able to get access to performance reviews of IAS officials, and they've looked at reserved category and non-reserved category. They don't find a difference. There's a fantastic study done by a political scientist of elected representatives from reserved seats as well as non-reserved seats. And there's a variety of indicators that she uses. The kinds of questions that they ask in the state assemblies, the amount of time they spent in office, the amount of offices in their own offices, the amount of time they spent in constituencies, listening to voters or constituents grievances, etc., etc. So you take a range of performance indicators and you compare you know legislators from reserve seats versus that, and you don't find a significant difference. So again, this is not to say that individuals, you can always turn around and to a point, oh, that particular reserved category individual in my office doesn't really work really well. And I'm sure that's true. But somebody else can point to a non-reserved category individual who doesn't work all that efficiently either, right? So we can't make these claims by casual observation because you can always find a counter example.
Yeah. So you mentioned, people picking on their anecdotal experiences, right? So with their experience, they view the reserved category population as not working as hard. Their colleagues who got in through reservation, they're not working as hard. Do you think, there might be some sort of implicit bias also sort of playing into this thing? Could you explain how, like, implicit discrimination sort of works in India? A lot of the times when people think about discrimination, they're thinking about like overt discrimination where you're actively acting and trying to discriminate someone. You're beating someone up, or you're telling that they're uninvited to the temple or something like that. Those are the kind of discrimination that comes into people's mind. Do you think there is like a more implicit biases and stuff like that that goes on?
Absolutely, and not just in India, So one of the things we have to understand is that implicit bias, these are called blind spots, so implicit bias is a huge area of study. Both psychologists and sociologists have studied it. And you can see examples of that around the world, which is not so implicit actually. Sometimes implicit will then turn out, UK at the moment is going through a very serious rioting, which is targeted towards immigrants, spread on the basis of some misinformation. So there was a very ghastly murder of three girls. And it is now clear that the murder was not done by an immigrant or a Muslim, but the far right groups in the UK have used this instance and are spreading misinformation and have gone on a rampage. There's this, it's a serious crisis. So it's an anti immigrant bias that's now, finding expression in a very violent form. So implicit bias and explicit bias are both realities. And explicit bias, if you look at attitude surveys, etc., you see a sort of a decline in the explicit bias because people know political correctness, what is called social desirability. Even if you feel a certain way, you're not going to say it because you know that that's you can't say things like that anymore. But people's beliefs can't be really truly hidden because they will come out either in very violent forms or perhaps not so violent forms. So implicit bias exists everywhere, and India is not an exception. So first of all, we have to recognize that it's not only in India that implicit bias is. There's a lot of research on implicit bias, and it's absolutely a fact that it enters, and sometimes we may not even be aware of it. You know, that's why it's called implicit bias. So there is, in fact, this Harvard, a researcher from Harvard University developed this implicit association test (IAT), which actually readers can go to the website and just do it for yourself. And it's just a test, and obviously it's not a final commentary or anything, but you can choose a category. So you can choose race, or you can choose even overweight versus, like, weight bias or age bias and gender and sexual orientation and all kinds of things, religion. And so I get my students to do those IATs, and I tell them, you choose your category and you do it. And it gives you a little score about implicit bias. So it's fun, just to see. Your listeners can try it out. So yeah, implicit bias is very much a reality.
Okay. Yeah. And you also mentioned that there is no data to show that, like reserved category people are less, meritorious when they're working in a institution and stuff like that. So some people, after we had done the presentation based on your words, all the empirical data and stuff like that, they said that the mistake is you're using empirical information. You have to use the Austrian a priori reasoning method to sort of figure out how things are going to play out. And they are proponents of the Austrian school of economics, so they believe that we have to use a priori reasoning to figure out how things are going to play out in economics. What do you have to say about that as an economist?
I'm not trained with that method, so whoever it is will have to teach me. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in empirical work. As you see, all my work is empirical. because otherwise it's your view versus mine, and you can continue to hold your view. I mean, I'm not saying you personally, but these individuals. So whoever it is, if you're listening to this podcast, uh, you know, please. But anyway, I believe in the empirical method, but data done correctly. I mean, data can be used in a variety of different ways. So I think that you have to use data correctly and with empathy, and which I will continue to do.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes sense. So another criticism that we received was like using a paper written by Chakraborty and Somanathan in 2008. So essentially, they argue that the wage difference between the reserved and unreserved categories is due to lower academic performance. It's not because of their caste or anything like that. What is your opinion on that argument? Like,
In a particular sample, that can always be true. I mean, I don't, because I know both the researchers, and their work is very careful. So with the data, they found that caste didn't matter. It was really just performance. In a way, I like that result because it shows that there are sectors where there is no caste-based discrimination. I mean, I'm not looking for. I my work is not to find caste-based discrimination when none exists. So if there is even small segments of the Indian labor market or some employers that genuinely don't discriminate on the basis of caste, that's very good news.
okay. The point is there is some caste-based discrimination at least.
So I mean, if examples of the non that no caste-based discrimination, if those examples could multiply, nothing could make me happier. You know. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, another question that people had is, we're looking at data from a specific state or from a specific sector and so on. So how are we able to sort of justify the whole reservation policy, which is applied as a nationwide, policy using these specific data from specific geographical locations and sectors?
So it's the when you make policies, there's always a trade-off between nuance and ease of implementation. You can make it very very localized, but then the danger is that nothing will get done because you'll say there's no data, right? Because like now you're having this whole thing about subdivision. Now where is the data on the individual jati level indicators? So a national level policy which doesn't reflect the reality of every state, like in Punjab for example, the SC proportion is close to 30, whereas the SC quota is 16.5%. So yeah, the national average doesn't reflect the situation for Punjab, or it may not reflect the situation for some other state. But it's a national average which reflects the situation for the country, right? And so, if the choice is between having a very nuanced policy, which then doesn't get implemented because there's no data, versus having a national policy which doesn't may not align with every state very accurately, but broadly speaking it takes care of the issue, I would be in favor of the former. So you have to, so yeah, nuance is very good, but ease of implementation and understanding is also necessary when it comes to policy. Nuance in terms of research, yes, as much nuance as you can get, because it's a paper we are writing, we need to get as much nuance data as possible. But think of a policy that every institution in the country has to implement. If you give a policy that spans 800 pages and say, okay, for this sector, for this state, for this district, for this thing, the proportion is X, but for that sector, for that state, for the proportion is Y. It's crazy. It'll be so difficult to implement. So how do you balance the two criteria, which is it should be locally relevant but also applicable? So one way to balance is to think of what needs to be done at the national level, what needs to be done at the state level, what needs to be done at the district level, what needs to be done at the block level. So make policies in at the level at which they need to be implemented. But if reservation is a national policy, then it has to be done at the national level. Or there needs to be a conversation about, can states have different quotas, etc., which has already started. But what I'm trying to say is that the more complication you introduce into the policy, the more difficult it becomes to implement it. So there are trade-offs. So one thing I would like your listeners to understand, including the critics of reservation, is that there is no policy without a trade-off. Reservation policy is no different. You gain in one direction, so you will lose something else. Every policy involves that, right? You give people work under NREGA, which means that money that is given to NREGA cannot then be used for something else. But will we then say, don't give NREGA? Of course not, right? So we choose what we want to spend money on what we want to target through our policies.
Yeah. So now the really controversial question, right? Even the people who are pro reservation, right? They agree that we need reservation. SCSTs need reservation. They're all for it. But when it comes to the Muslims, no. I mean, people are very skeptical about like the Muslim reservation. They have a really huge problem with it. So should Muslims receive reservation?
So, a lot of Muslim communities and, in fact, Christian communities also are included in the OBC category. So, if you look at state level OBC lists, in many states in India, including in Kerala and other states as well, Muslim communities are included in OBCs, in the OBCs. Now, for scheduled castes, that is Dalits, Muslims and Christians are not eligible for reservation. So the SC category currently is applicable to three religions: Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. Okay. Now, the argument that the government gives is that, and it has given it in repeated court hearings, is that Dalits who converted, like Hindu Dalits who converted to Islam or Christianity, because of due to their conversion, they ceased being regarded as Dalit or untouchable. And because of that, because their social situation changed, they no longer need reservation. Again, sorry to the Austrian whatever proponents of whichever method, it's an empirical question. So if you look at the data on Dalits and Muslims who identify themselves as Dalit, because there is no category called SC for Muslims and Christians. But in data, often you will find people who will say, I'm an SC Muslim or an SC Christian, which legally that person cannot be. But what it reflects is that that's what they think they are. Uh, when you look at outcomes for those individuals within Islam and within Christianity in India, you do find these caste like divisions in a way that you don't find within Islam and Christianity outside of India, right? And so, caste, in amongst other religions, sociologists have written about it. So, I just feel that if caste untouchability is the reason why we had this SC reservation, then we have to think of including Muslims and Christians as well, because they might have been untouchables who converted to Islam or Christianity, but maybe they didn't escape their low status. So there are examples of cemeteries being different for SC Christians and so-called upper caste Christians, or SC Muslims and so-called upper caste Muslims. In Bihar, the politicians have talked about Pasmanda Muslimans versus the sort of more upper, well-to-do Muslims, etc. So there is differentiation there as well. So, yeah, I mean, if you're going empirically, then we need to pay attention to these. In OBC, already they're included. Many Muslim communities are included.
So it was very nice having you on our channel. A lot of our audience have been requesting to bring Dr. Ashwini Deshpande for a long time after since we had done the presentation. They wanted to sort of ask you some questions and stuff like that. So yeah, these were the questions that a lot of our audience had regarding our presentation and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you for coming on to our channel and answering those questions for our audience.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure talking to you.